This is the CBS Evening News. Connie Chung sitting in for Dan Rather. Good evening. More than $500 billion. The Commerce Department today said the United States foreign debt reached that record level last year. In 1981, this country was the world's largest creditor nation. Today's figures confirm our standing as the world's largest debtor. A private analyst warns we are exceedingly vulnerable as a country. Richard Roth reports.
The government figures confirm what every foreign tourist already knew. America is a shopper's paradise. But foreigners aren't just buying off the shelves. In record numbers now, they're buying up the stores. The debt is the difference between what Americans own overseas and what foreigners own here. And it's huge. More than $500 billion last year, up almost 41% from the year before. Foreign purchases of U.S. firms is one big reason. In just the past year, the British have built a new American empire that includes fast food and fine clothing. New Japanese investments range from CBS Records to rubber tires. And a lot of the profits from Florida orange juice now are pouring into the Canadian company that bought Tropicana. Direct foreign investment in U.S. firms last year was up 21%.
The figures look large in themselves, but then the United States economy is a massive machine, and one that I think is well able to stand up to this sort of investment level.
The administration agrees, arguing the influx of foreign capital helps the American economy, and foreigners help pay for America's growing budget deficit by investing in U.S. government bonds.
We're scaring ourselves to death for nothing. What these figures show is that foreign ownership in the United States is rising. This shows that we are very successful. People want to invest here.
But an auto parts dealer in Montgomery, Alabama is among those who worry the buying simply gotten out of hand.
Because other nations want America. They want to own this country. Now, we fought a couple of world wars to keep them from doing that.
The foreign buying spree is fueled by dollars Americans spend on foreign products, such as the cars and electronic goods Japan sells here. It's a form of reinvestment. But it's not consumer goods the Japanese are buying in America. This Tokyo TV ad is for Manhattan real estate. It's estimated Japan already owns 40% of downtown Los Angeles, and the trend, like the skyline, is soaring. Richard Roth, CBS News, New York.
The Japanese may be gobbling up parts of America, but Japanese businessmen are not about to let Americans horn in on their companies. That was clear today when a Japanese company gave a well-known American corporate raider a swift boot. Bill Whitaker has the story.
Into Tokyo today for a showdown with corporate Japan. As the largest stockholder in the Koito Manufacturing Company, Pickens demanded to become the first foreigner on the company's board of directors. The Japanese shot him down.
If they don't open up their financial markets, they've got real problems.
But Koito says the problem is Pickens' reputation as a corporate raider.
It has a very bad image in Japan. Therefore, what he is going to do may not be well understood by Japanese businessmen.
Pickens sees himself like a latter-day Commodore Perry, forcing Japan to open up to the West. But many Japanese see him more like Darth Vader, intent on destroying their economic world.
Well, it just doesn't make sense to me.
Well, I think part of it is they don't want to believe. They don't want to believe that you're here for the long term.
Like many American businessmen in Japan, Pickens got caught in the cultural crossfire. When he looked at Koito, he saw a profitable manufacturer of automobile lights. Japanese say companies like Koito are more than businesses, they're social units, where workers eat together and use their breaks to discuss productivity.
You're coming up against a cultural barrier now. In other words, that's the way that Japanese view their companies. They view them as families. So, and you just don't buy and sell families.
But Japanese don't hesitate to buy U.S. businesses. Some of America's biggest singing stars now record for a Japanese label. Japanese businesses are everywhere. They're even buying up cattle ranches. But what's acceptable abroad is taboo in Japan.
And it is these differences which are really at the heart of the continuing trade frictions that we have with Japan.
I think people in America are getting a little bit tired of the $55 billion deficit that we have in our trading with the Japanese.
Pickens says he'll be back to try again this fall. the corporate raider as free market crusader. Bill Whitaker, CBS News, Tokyo.
Chinese Premier Li Peng publicly condemned international criticism of China's crackdown on dissent today, but there are signs that the leadership privately is worried about world impact of its actions. And as Eric Engberg reports, China is finding new ways to keep its citizens in tow.
The long lines of Chinese gathering at Beijing's embassies are now seen by the communist leadership as a potentially damaging brain drain. The response is more repression. CBS News has learned that the Communist Party has ordered a further clampdown on foreign travel by all Chinese, action shutting off their main legal avenue of escape. Echoing the hard line, government spokesmen continued to heap scorn on countries which criticize the repression, especially the U.S. for giving refuge to leading dissident Fang Lijier and his wife.
There's evidence that at least some of China's leaders understand how the country has become increasingly isolated from the rest of the world in recent weeks. Many of China's foreign ambassadors are being called back home to make sure they understand the party line.
Stringent controls on nighttime travel are being enforced, particularly at military roadblocks in the central city. Aggressiveness by the troops seems motivated partly by the fact that many leading dissidents, such as student leader Wu Rukai-shi, appear to be slipping out of the country undetected, and partly by the fact that anger about the crackdown has broken violently into the open. Diplomatic sources say 2 occupation soldiers were set upon by unknown attackers, strangled and thrown into a downtown canal where their bodies were found later. Despite such clear acts of retribution, Western diplomats are discounting the possibility that any underground resistance can be sustained in a police state as tightly regimented as this one. Eric Engberg, CBS News, Beijing.
Here in the U.S., Chinese scholars stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial today and dramatically broke with the Communist Party. And only a few blocks away, the House of Representatives broke with President Bush and voted for new sanctions against China. Bill Plant reports.
The yeas are 418. The nays are 0.
It was unanimous. Despite a plea from the White House that the United States speak with just one voice, the House of Representatives voted tougher sanctions against China than the president's. The House package would suspend trade and development programs and ban the sale of police equipment as well as some high technology and nuclear materials. The administration sees the bill, which has not yet gone to the Senate, as trespassing on the president's prerogatives.
We cannot support it in its current form. I was then asked, well, have you said you would veto it? And I said, we haven't gone that far yet, but I've said we can't support it.
In sharp contrast to the policy the Bush administration calls measured response, Chinese scholars gathered at the Lincoln Memorial today announced that more than 300 of them are, in effect, giving up everything, publicly renouncing their membership in the Communist Party, and with that, probably the right to go home.
We hereby solemnly and publicly resign from the Chinese Communist Party.
The words of Abraham Lincoln at Gettysburg had a new meaning for those who watched the slaughter in Tiananmen Square.
They shall not have died in vain.
Speaking out may have serious consequences for these Chinese, and they know it. Law professor Ye Ning, who says he was tortured during the Cultural Revolution, knows he can't go home.
We will always be endangered if we return to our homeland.
Kugang and his wife Meng Zhan worry what may happen to their 2-year-old daughter in China, but both felt they had to speak out anyway.
They can do whatever they want. It's kind of sometimes they are just beyond the logic.
There is sadness and a sense of loss. But Gong Shu says the party taught him one thing well.
You have to put the interest of your nation above your own interest. I think at this point, I'm doing exactly the same way they told us.
Because of their education and their party membership, these people were among China's elite.
I would have a nice future in China at home, but I don't think I can hide my feeling longer.
But unless things change in China, they have given up that future for a dream of freedom. Bill Plant, CBS News, Washington.
An American journalist captured by communist authorities in Afghanistan is said to be in good condition in a Kabul jail. The description came from a U.S. diplomat who flew in today to see Tony O'Brien. He's a freelance photographer who was traveling with Muslim rebels fighting the Soviet-backed government. O'Brien was captured 3 weeks ago at a guerrilla hideout in Kabul. The government put him on display at a news conference earlier this week. No word on when he might be released. Israel ignored protests from the U.S. and the UN and deported 8 more Palestinians from the occupied West Bank and Gaza today. An army helicopter dumped them off in southern Lebanon. The Israelis have now expelled 55 Palestinians since the Arab uprising began. Still to come on the CBS Evening News, Terrence Smith on the HUD scandal and the cost to taxpayers. And Frank Courier on the baseball investigation and the cost to Pete Rose. In Bush's flag campaign, House Republican leader Bob Michel and Democrat Sonny Montgomery of Mississippi introduced an amendment in Congress to change the Constitution and nullify last week's Supreme Court ruling that burning the flag is constitutional free expression. The proposed constitutional amendment would prohibit physical desecration of the flag. President Bush officially proposed his long-awaited action plan today for cleanup and overhaul of campaign financing. CBS News White House correspondent Leslie Stahl reports Mr. Bush's proposals are also seen as a way to help get more Republicans elected to Congress at the expense of Democrats.
President Bush's package of campaign finance reforms declares war on what Republicans call the incumbent protection system that has kept Democrats in control of the House of Representatives for over 30 years.
Today, incumbents stay in office for decades, amassing huge war chests to scare off strong challenges in election after election. This is not democracy in the spirit of Madison and Jefferson.
Specifically, Mr. Bush wants to abolish all political action committees connected to unions, corporations, and trade associations. In the '88 campaign, those PACs gave a total of $115 million to incumbents, only $17 million to challengers. He wants to reduce drastically congressional mailing privileges, the so-called frank, that last year alone allowed incumbents to send out $114 million worth of mail to constituents, in effect campaign advertising paid for by taxpayers. Democrats, whose own reform package calls for campaign spending limits, immediately labeled the president's plan purely partisan.
The president's campaign finance reform bill ought to be labeled the Fat Cat Protection Act of 1989. He wants to make it easier to give to Republican candidates.
White House officials admit the president's bill was drafted by the Republican National Committee with an eye toward exploiting the GOP's superior fundraising machine. For instance, the package calls for a 150% increase in the amount political parties can spend on congressional candidates. For presidential races, it would allow the parties to continue raising so-called soft money used to get around spending limits. And the plan would still allow ideological political action committees.
But I find it quaint that the PACs that the president chooses to limit appear to be only the PACs which would appear to favor Democrats over Republicans.
Republicans say they can make the anti-incumbent message work.
People are going to rise up and say, hey, we'd like these elections back in our hands. We'd like a house of the people again instead of the house of incumbents, which it has become.
There may be a yearning in the country for campaign reform, but will the president's package fly? He is sending it to Congress, which is 58% Democratic, and more to the point, 100% incumbent. Leslie Stahl, CBS News, the White House.
Former Speaker of the House Jim Wright ended his 35-year career in Congress today. He left the House of Representatives, walked out of the Capitol, and went home to Texas. Wright resigned as Speaker and from Congress amid accusations of unethical practices. Sources confirmed a Washington Times report today that D.C. police and the Internal Revenue Service are investigating a male prostitution ring whose clients may have included people connected to the Bush and Reagan administrations. But the sources told CBS News there is no indication at present that the investigation involves any high government or military officials. To Luxembourg was closely questioned by Congress today. Not about his diplomatic post, but as part of the spreading investigation into possible influence peddling and other corruption in housing and urban development programs. Terrence Smith reports.
The spotlight in the congressional hearings into the HUD scandal focused today on Fred Bush, no relation to the president, but a close aide on his vice presidential staff and finance director of the Bush-Quayle campaign. He denied under sharp questioning that he had used his political influence to win HUD funds for a number of rehabilitation and development projects in Puerto Rico.
Your statement is that you were not trying to use your political influence on behalf of the project with Deborah Dean.
That's correct. My political influence... Mr. Frank, I didn't felt I had any political influence.
Mr. Bush, that is one of the least honest answers I have ever heard.
Well, it's true.
It's certainly true that he dealt with HUD at the top level, contacting Deborah Gore Dean, the executive assistant to former Housing Secretary Samuel Pierce and a key figure in the investigation.
You went to the executive assistant to the secretary to find out what the procedures were?
I said that
is
before.
The most preposterous answer
Frank,
I have ever gotten. Well, you did not. I just don't believe you.
Mr. Frank, I was very used to going to the person I could, at the top, if I could get to that person.
To talk about the procedures?
To talk about anything.
Bush and Company, the consulting firm he set up after leaving the vice presidential staff, earned more than $500,000 in fees for work on 8 different projects in Puerto Rico. But at least one proposal failed to meet HUD standards.
The proposal was reviewed by several people whose job it is professionally to review these projects at HUD. And they didn't like your project. They thought it was a lousy project.
But the project was approved anyway by the political friends Fred Bush says he never used. Terrence Smith, CBS News, Washington.
The Commerce Department reported today that sales of new single-family homes rose 2.7% in May. Analysts said declining interest rates helped home sales. But the annual rate of 613,000 units remained well below that of the past 2 years. Suspense mounted today over what and when the Supreme Court would rule on a major abortion rights case. It was not among the rulings handed down and handed out to reporters today. The court will issue the last of its rulings for this term on Monday. Abortion won't necessarily be one of them. Chief Justice William Rehnquist left open the possibility today that one or more pending cases could be carried over to the court's next term.
OBrien, part of your health kick? Yeah, helps ensure I get enough fiber.
Each morning, Tracy Reed takes out some fiber insurance with Kellogg's OBrien, concentrated fiber that can help her meet the National Cancer Institute's guidelines for a high-fiber, low-fat diet. A diet some studies suggest may reduce the risks of certain forms of...
Try new Preparation H Cream, a soothing cream with a pleasant scent. It helps shrink swelling of tissues as it often relieves pain and itching for hours. New Preparation H Cream from doctor-recommended Preparation H.
I eat nutritious meals with plenty of fruit and vegetables. So how come I'm the one with painful gas?
Surprise! Foods high in nutrition are often high in gas. But Gas X gets rid of the gas, so you feel better fast. Eat right and feel right with Gas X.
There was no action in the Cincinnati courts today on Reds manager Pete Rose and his alleged illegal gambling activities. But the lawyers kept busy. And Frank Currier reports the change in Rose's image is costing baseball's all-time hits leader a lot of money.
Pete Rose huddled with his lawyers today, who say they'd like to cut a deal with baseball. His other legal team met today in Washington with Commissioner Bart Giamatti for depositions, but no deals.
Would you accept the plea bargain, please? There's been no conversation about that.
Only yesterday, an appeals judge in Cincinnati handed baseball its second defeat in the battle over who should decide, the courts or the commissioner, whether Rose ever gambled on his own game.
If he were willing to take a 1 or 2 year suspension, I think that's a place to start talking.
With a flood of damning new evidence against Rose flowing daily from baseball's 8-volume investigative report, Rose fans and foes are buying up copies at $230 each.
I want to read it, and then I'll dash it away with the rest stuff for a piece of history, yeah.
In the report, there's text of a phone call between Rose accuser Paul Jansen and a New York business partner of Rose, Mike Bertolini. The conversation, secretly recorded by Jansen, focuses on alleged gambling debts, money owed to them by Rose.
Did you ever get settled up with Pete?
About what?
The money?
We're working it out. I don't know. Did you ever?
He still owes me about 12 grand.
So he paid you about 38?
He's into me for about anywhere from, I don't know, once you figure out all the autograph stuff, he probably owes me about anywhere from like 10 to 12,000.
There wasn't one thing mentioned in that tape about baseball. Not one thing. Not one thing.
Dive right into those sweeties, Pete.
The scandal has cost Rose more than his reputation. Off the field, his estimated annual $500,000 in endorsements and appearances have almost dried up, his lawyers say, while on Madison Avenue, he's history.
It's over. He will not make a penny. The only thing he could probably advertise is Rose's lime juice.
While lawyers for both sides work privately to avoid a lengthy war in the courts, only an appeal or a deal could stop next week's showdown hearing in a county court. Frank Courier, CBS News, Cincinnati.
Members of the Cincinnati City Council say they won't change the name of Pete Rose Way. That was the name they gave to what had been 2nd Street after Rose broke Ty Cobb's career hits record in 1985. But a councilwoman said, I think we should go back to our policy of not naming streets for living people. Texas say the poisoning may have been part of a ritual. They say it may have been an effort to cast a magic spell to protect a woman or a spell involving a rivalry over a woman. Officially, the motive remains a mystery, but police have a suspect in a poisoning case that attracted national attention. James Hattori reports.
He's at the top of Austin's most hated list. Police today arrested Paul Stedman Cullen, a farm supply worker, for attempting to destroy a piece of Texas history. For weeks, the city's legendary Treaty Oak, under which Texans supposedly made peace with the Indians 150 years ago, has been withering, a victim of poisoning.
He is going to receive vigorous prosecution, I can assure you of that.
It would almost seem to me that a person who would do that is mentally deranged.
Cullen lived alone in a truck outside of town. This afternoon, officials said an informant heard Cullen confess to the crime. They say he went looking for an oak tree to poison, but they're not saying why.
We couldn't categorize it as a random act. It is true from the probable cause affidavit that he did look for an oak tree to poison.
Experts are still working to save Treaty Oak by removing poisoned soil and by protecting it from the harsh sun. The rescue efforts, combined with the affection shown by local residents, give many cause for hope.
I think that just from the outpouring of love that this tree is going to make it.
If convicted, Cullen could face up to 20 years in prison for criminal mischief. It may be several months before anyone knows if the victim will survive. James Hattori, CBS News, Austin.
And that's the CBS Evening News. We hope you'll stay tuned for Dan Rather with 48 Hours on the Border, a close look at the rush of aliens to this country. That's at 8/7 Central Time. I'm Connie Chung in New York, sitting in for Dan Rather. I'll see you again tomorrow night. Thank you for joining us, and for all of us at CBS News, good night.
America cracks down on a flood of new immigrants on the front lines of a new border war. An all-new 48 Hours tonight. This is CBS.